Doctors, what's the worst state a person has come in? My cousin works in the when we lived together, one day she come home telling me about a patient that tried to cut his own head off with a chainsaw. They had to sew his tongue onto the remaining tissue of his neck because otherwise it would have died off. Obviously he passed out from the pain before he could get to the vital parts of his neck, but I still imagine this to be pretty gruesome. Doc here, 26-year-old girl, unrestrained passenger riding with a drunk driver. Her head went into the windshield and popped the whole windshield off the car. Her skull was filleted open from the forehead up, brain completely exposed and falling out of her skull, largely intact but horribly swollen. Rest of her face and body was essentially unmarked. She was breathing on her own, but not moving purposefully. She got intubated, taken to the operating room. I asked the neurosurgeon what the plan was, and he said, I'm just gonna cut off the part that's sticking out. She had a partial lobotomy, skull was left open with the hope the swelling would go down. She was basically brain dead that night and died a week later. Driver was drunk, but had a seat belt on. Walked out of the that night. I always tell people, when drunk driving is mentioned and not being taken seriously, that at best you kill yourself, at worst it's a family of 5 and you'll be alive, and no, you killed them every day forever. I once saw a 4-year-old girl whose head was run over by her dad tractor by accident. Her and her mother had went out to give him food during harvest after dark. He was ready to get started and they thought she was in the truck. Unfortunately ran over her head. She was still alive. Field trash tube. Just awful. Certain things you can't unsee. My mom was a nurse, and she said the worst case she ever had to deal with involved a kid whose parents had backed over them in the driveway. Apparently the toddler had the skin of their face completely pulled off where the tire had basically pinched it off of them. The kid survived, but my mom said she'll never forget the screams of that child. That was why we had a rule of, the kids will stand on the steps and wait until the engine is off of the parent coming home. If they can't do that, the door stays closed until the person in the car opens the door. I didn't go, but a partner of mine had to go to a call like that. Dad backed over 2-year-old who followed him outside and went behind the SUV. Kid didn't make it, and 7 out of 12 people on my shift had toddlers. The childless partner took that call from the guy who was supposed to go. Nope, not living with that guilt. Med student here, graduating this year, had a guy come in who jumped in front of the subway. He was brought in with a weak pulse, but a second ambulance came in shortly after and handed me a garbage bag. I thought it was his belongings, but when I looked inside, it was the patient's right leg. Apparently his leg was trapped under the train and decision was made to do a baloney amputation in the field. It was taking too long to get the train lifted. According to the train conductor, the patient looked him straight in the eye and jumped in front as the train was pulling in. We also did resuscitative thoracotomy, cracked his ribs for direct access to massage the heart, but he was too far gone, and we pronounced him shortly after. Not a doctor, but I used to work for the county coroner, nights and weekends. Got a call one night, real late, like 2 AM. It was cold and foggy as hell. Call was to the country, middle of nowhere. I live in a big ag area, tons of farms and dairies and orchards. Get to the site to see emergency services everywhere. Sheriffs, fire engines, paramedics, and a giant crane. Apparently a guy who worked the farm decided to get drunk and go to the field in the middle of the night. Wound up flipping his tractor into an irrigation ditch and it smashed down on top of him. When the crane lifted the tractor clear and the floods lit up the ditch, I couldn't even tell what I was looking at. Just human meat. My coworker said he used to work security at the hospital. Guy comes in saying he feels woozy, asks if they have a payphone. He goes over, puts the change in to make a call, and drops dead. Apparently he got shot in the head by a stray bullet and didn't know. A nurse here. About 2 weeks ago we had a young guy who was in an argument with his partner while off his head on drugs. Ended up stabbing himself in the chest 7 times, including once through the heart. Surgeons had to operate while he was in our department and he went into cardiac arrest twice, but we were able to bring him back. Ended up transferring him to a specialist trauma hospital, but heard that about a week later he died on intensive care. Doctor here. Worst shape I saw in the air was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He still had a weak pulse when he arrived, but the exit wound had half of his brain just peeking out of it. He didn't last much longer, and we called the code not long after. Interestingly, the entrance wound was tiny and barely noticeable. This was one of my first trauma cases in medical school. What I remember most was that he had some of the bluest eyes I have ever seen, and he seemed almost hauntingly peaceful. It makes me very sad to think of what emotional turmoil he must have been going through when he pulled the trigger, and I feel terrible for what his family must have experienced, so close to the Christmas holiday as well. We had a patient who had some gangrene near a vein caused by needle use. She left the hospital against medical advice before receiving any treatment. Came back a few weeks later, and her entire arm was necrotic to the point it looked mummified. She had lost use of it some time ago, and was just so high it wasn't a concern, until she started getting violently ill. Had to amputate at her shoulder. Probably would have only had to do some skin grafts, had she not left in the first place. Not as graphic as some of the others here, but I can't believe a person could walk around like that for so long, like it was nothing. Don't do drugs, kids. Not a doctor, but I'm related to an EMT who responded to a high voltage incident. Guy was trying to get something down from a power line, and became part of the power line. Fell 10 plus feet after being electrocuted. The EMT told me the smell was like bacon. He was basically cooked inside and out. Guy was aware of what was going on and what happened, but his organs began to fail him the next day. He died after a week in the hospital, and his power of attorney took him off life support a week later. Edit. Relative and I both were surprised at the response to this. Thank you. Not a doctor, but my ex-husband decided to attempt suicide slowly while driving after he and I had a fight. When I got to the hospital, found out he'd cut himself 21 times on one arm and 8 on the other. They had to do emergency surgery to reattach his hands. He left with a steak knife and a box cutter, and it was game on. Every time he got to a stoplight, he'd make a slash. I saw the truck after he did it. Looked like he stabbed 8 people to death in there. Blood, flesh, and hair everywhere. It was awful. He survived. We got divorced, became great friends, set him up with his new wife, but sadly he committed suicide last January 2021. She found him in the backyard with a shotgun blast to the mouth. She's so fucked up from seeing that. He was a nice person. Such a shame. Former hospital worker. Had a young man who got careless with his chainsaw, lowered the business end, and it went halfway from toes to ankle through his foot. Had a doc that was highly critical of the EMTs. They brought a covered gurney and said this one's doer. Doc says they are not dead until I say they are dead. Pulled back the cover and the occupant's head was tucked under one arm, fully detached. Doc, he's dead. Not a doctor, but my friend's nurse said in her 25 years of working trauma he was the worst she'd ever seen. He crashed his motorcycle into a guardrail which mangled his left leg. That impact threw him off the bike, through the air, and into a sign. He hit the sign with his chest. The sign not only ripped off the steel post, but the post bent then ripped out of the ground, concrete and all. That impact broke his sternum, which, in turn shredded heart muscle. He coded 5 times on the way to the hospital and another on the table. Doctors gave him a 0.001 chance of survival. That was 9 months ago. He's currently learning to walk with a prosthetic leg. His heart is strong enough that they cleared him to use Viagra. He's an honest to God miracle. My mom was a trauma nurse. The most haunting story she ever told me was about a man that was refinishing his wood floors in the basement. He'd apparently left whatever finish or stain too close to the furnace, causing the fluid to ignite and basically blow up all over him. He had 3rd-degree burns all over his body. The worst part was that his chest was so charred and burned that they had to make these huge vertical cuts along his torso so that he could breathe without his skin basically cracking. My mom also told me how his room had a particular smell that never seemed to go away. The other nurses and doctors said they smelled it whenever they walked by, likely psychological. I was never afraid of fire until I heard that story. The man made a full recovery several weeks/months later. Man missing both of his arms and a leg after a propane tank exploded under his grill while he was cooking dinner. Only reason he survived was a fire station was only a block away. 3 tourniquets in place on arrival. Edit. A document. Not a doctor, but a first responder. Call came out as someone ill. He'd had an online doctor appointment earlier in the day and doctor wanted him to go to the hospital. Arrived and thought he was dead. He was in a recliner with his mouth gaping open. Skin looked awful, and one of his feet were turned an unnatural way. His mouth was dry and gums were a tried blood color. He had another large bruise that looked like blood pooling after death around his eye. I've seen people who've been dead for 2 to 3 days who looked better than him. Dude hadn't been in great health to begin with, but had been significant decline for 2 weeks and no one called the paramedics. Blood pressure was so low it couldn't be obtained manually. Not a doctor, but my mother was a nurse. Guy came in after a motorcycle accident, back in the days before helmets and full leathers were commonplace. He had been completely engulfed in a fuel fire and had full body, non-survivable burns. He was burned beyond recognition and she couldn't even hold his hand as there was nothing much to hold. As there was nothing they could do bar pain relief, my mother stayed after her shift so someone was with him until he died. When she got home, she discovered it had been her neighbor.